So picking up where we left off, we're going to dig right into one of the core issues for human rights, and that's the continuing challenges that we face for girls and women. And this is a topic that we care very deeply about at Ford and have worked on for over 40 years. And these next two speakers and our moderator have more than enough accumulated experience, wisdom, and insight to take us on this critical topic. So please join me in welcoming moderator Cynthia McFadden in conversation with Michelle Bachelet and Melanne Verveer.
Watch the film, we realized we were the film, so here we are. I wish all of you could have been backstage. We were having an extremely good conversation, but I can't tell you what it was about. No, actually it was about high heels and how we wish we didn't ever have to wear them, and other important matters. Anyway, thank you all for having me here today. I have been a big admirer of the Ford Foundation for many years. In fact, I feel that I owe my job in journalism in many ways to the Ford Foundation. My first job out of Columbia Law School was working for Fred Friendly, who had started his entire public television program. Yes, Fred. Those of you who knew him knew that Fred was a towering figure, and he would often point in people's faces and say, "I created television before you were born." And I would be like, yes, you did. Anyway. So I feel a particular kinship with the Ford Foundation. It's a pleasure to be here, especially with these two women who I admire so extravagantly for the work that you have done and the work that you will do. So thank you for letting me ask you some, I hope not too rude questions. Let's start with September 5th, 1995. Melanne, I know that you know right where you were on that day. Then the First Lady, Hillary Clinton, made a statement that seemed oh so simple. Women's rights are human rights. It turned out not to be quite that easy.
Well, in fact, it's not that easy, but even in those days, it was quite stunning to believe that human rights really didn't consist in many ways of women's rights. And I think let me just say from the outset, I want to thank the Ford Foundation and congratulate you on this big anniversary. But Ford made a great deal possible when it came to the UN Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing. And bringing particularly so many women activists from around the world would not have been possible without the commitment of this foundation to that effort. And going into 1995, Beijing, what we were taking with us was a long road of activism that in the preceding conference, for example, had put violence against women just on the agenda, but it wasn't a violation of human rights in most people's understanding. Many of the issues that then First Lady Hillary Clinton uttered in that litany of atrocities perpetrated against women as violations of human rights. Many, to that point, had never really seen these issues as critical to their understanding of the broader concept of human rights. And frankly, for me, it was astounding as I thought about it. And it wasn't always easy. There was the human rights community and the women's rights community. And there were many in the human rights community who were saying at the time, why go to Beijing? Why do a favor to the Chinese? Why? And nobody was doing the Chinese a favor, but we were determined to try to advance women's rights as human rights. And I think this acceptance, finally, at least chiseled in international law, even though the full realization of those rights is always, I always still feel they're separate categories and shouldn't be the case. But I think that definitive moment of saying once and for all, women's rights are human rights, having the laws reflect that. And now the hard work, as you said, Cynthia, continues, which is to ensure the full fruition of these rights in the lives of women around the world.
Well, your present position with Secretary Clinton, now Secretary Clinton, is in part testimony to progress. Tick off for me, though, a couple of the things you would point to in the last 16 years which have advanced the cause.
Well, certainly the numbers of laws that have been passed, if not always implemented and enforced, that now criminalize violence against women. We have still considerable work to do to ensure the full implementation. The recognition of economic rights for women and that whole growing body of women's economic participation and what it represents. The activism that it sparked, that to this day is really a significant symbol of what empowered women can do at the local level to make a difference, is quite striking. In fact, I'm always not surprised anymore, but it's always telling that when women who participated in Beijing introduce themselves, whether to the Secretary of State or to me, they will give their name, and then if it's the case, they will say, and I was in Beijing. And that is shorthand for saying, I subscribe to the platform for action that we're all still working on.
Which brings us to a question of where you were, Michelle Bachelet, 16 years ago, in September of 1995.
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, I want to thank the Ford Foundation, because not only it helped us a lot during our difficult times during the Chilean dictatorship, but also afterwards building the new society in transition. And I was there working at the Ministry of Health, trying to incorporate women's health rights, sexual and reproductive rights at the Ministry of Health. And I have to tell you that when you look back and say how much we have progress, I mean, today when, for example, on the CSW this year, there was so huge discussions about including an article that spoke about sexual education. I mean, that was thought sort of a dirty word. You say to yourself when you go again to Beijing and the action platform, it was so impressive and so advanced in a way, but we still need to ensure that all this advancement really are made a reality, because we have advanced a lot in terms of awareness, in terms of getting together, as Marlene said, women who had been part of women's rights movement, but also human rights movement, together, to work together, to push together. We have a lot of governments have understood, or because they have acknowledged, or because civil society and human rights groups and women's groups have pushed. They have a lot of legislation concerning violence against women, concerning political participation, even though that's the worst, still the worst progress. Access to justice, even it's still a lot of problems, and we launch here the report on progress on women in pursuit of justice. But the big problem that we have on gender equality and women's empowerment, the biggest of all, I mean, worldwide, of course, there are particular regions with particular challenges, is implementation. I mean, how we pass from wording, lip service, to reality, to action. Because lip service, it's so huge. Everybody said how substantial women are in the middle of all the challenges of the 21st century. Women are the solution for the climate change. Women are the solution, but I do believe that it is true that the women are not the problem. Right. I mean, women are also part of the solution for the financial crisis, for everything. But when you see what really happens, the ministries and the ministers are the weakest. They're under-resourced and so on. So that, I believe, is our big challenge, continue creating more awareness, but also implementing, having new legislation, advancing much more in all areas, but also implementing it.
But I think, if I might, I think that's one reason why it's so critically important to build the capacity of the activists at the local level and support them so they can, one, be at the table and have the advocacy for them to get there, but to be effective at the table. And I think that's another thing that this foundation has been committed to over the years that has been absolutely essential and continues to be really important.
If I may add to that, because for us, that's why we have considered that our main priorities is empowering women. Because unfortunately, I mean, there has been progress, but in many places of the world, women are not relevant enough. They're not strong constituencies, so they're not sitting at the table, for example, on the peace talks. They're not considered in many decisions. So we need, and that's why we're going to work. Of course, we are partners, and we're national partners are governments and civil society and women's organizations, and of course, private sector. And our international partners, like for Foundation and also the private sector. Because I think we need all stakeholders here together to push and advance in progressing on women's rights.
Well, just by way of example, I mean, Libya, where women were on the front lines, I mean, smuggling money for the rebels in baby diapers and bullets in their purses, and now they are told, it's not really the time, dear, for your rights, right?
Well, that's an old story. I mean, you could hear that from South Africa, because the South African minister told me that they went to see Mandela, said, Madiba, you need to help us, we don't want, we've been in jail with you, we're dying with you, we've been in prison, we have been fighting with you, but now we're not going back to the kitchen. And he will help her, really. So it's an old story, because you always hear that stuff. And there are some places where women are very reasonable, and they believe that, okay, it's not the opportunity. Because, of course, when you have been in a war, or you are in a transition, of course, there's so many issues that need to be considered. How you build a new political system, how you build a new electoral system, how you ensure the reform of the security sector, including justice, armed forces, police forces. So, of course, there is an incredible agenda that is, but if you don't include gender issues there and women's rights, it's really a pity. And it's not only in Libya. In Egypt and Tunis, we have an opportunity. But it hasn't been easy for the women and the girls. We have been working supporting them, because in those places, when there was no democracy, young people didn't have the experience in politics. They don't know how to organize themselves. So we have to be very present there, helping them and supporting them what they think they need to do. Not coming and impose any recipe, but to help them in their effort.
So give us a status report. How are things with the women who have struggled through the Arab Spring? Do you find that they're having a seat at the table?
I think that it is a very tough struggle, and the Arab Spring, I pray, will not become the winter of our discontent. But if one were to sit with women in Egypt, older women who have been on the front lines for many years, enacting some of the kinds of positive changes that have occurred there, as well as the young social media experts who have really pushed the envelope in a way that brought us to this day. They have different concerns, but they have significant concerns. And, you know, writing a new constitution for Egypt is a serious consideration for the future of the women there. How they will go forward is quite a matter of concern, because if you look at all the signs already, from their not being part of negotiating teams, from the Ministry for Women being disbanded, for the Commission on Women that was an implementing arm being sidelined, to a series of decisions, including no quota for representation in the parliament that now has taken place. These are matters of worry. And so we have been, the US government has been raising them every inch of the way. Our initiatives that we're supporting are very focused in many ways on women, both in terms of the democratic process, in terms of capacity building, in terms of the upcoming elections, but also in terms of economic empowerment, which is critically important, that as we talk about trying to staunch the tailspin that their economy is in, that women are a focus of those efforts. In Libya, the secretary raised in the contact meeting just a week or so ago the fact that women need to be taken seriously in Libya, because the draft constitution is certainly the provisional draft that's been done is troubling, and the fact that women have not been participating as they might as this new coalitional effort goes forward, and the women are beginning to flex their muscle as best they can in those circumstances. But this is where they need others to validate them. They need the governments who are in all of these sessions that represent resources coming in, represent decisions for the future. They need support for their civil society activities from kindred support organizations. And they need to have their issues raised in the media constantly. So it's every party in many ways has a role to play.
But what levers do the two of you have at your disposal, or can you operationalize to help them? Because, you know, Fred Friendly used to say, when they say it ain't the money, it's the money. And you know, in some ways, I mean, you have the bully pulpit, and that's a progress. Okay, that's a big progress from 16 years ago. But, I mean,
well, what I just said really is one of those levers. Being able to focus America's resources now in a way that truly factors in an appreciation for the role that women have to play, which we are doing.
but how hardball can we go? Are we willing to say, okay, if you don't do this, we're going to withhold the funds for X?
Well,
Are we
I don't
willing
know
to
if you've
say-
checked lately. There aren't a whole lot of adherence always to what we'd like to see happen, which doesn't stop us from trying to make it happen, but also being smart about how the investments get made. If the United States is viewed as the provider of the resources in some cases, it's not the best way to go. But if we can put those resources in UN Women, for example, to help create a coordinated strategy for the women in Egypt, it makes a lot more sense.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's not only about money. I mean, money is important. It's always not enough. And UN Women need much more money.
Well,
if
pause
I can
right-
pass a commercial.
Well, hold it. No, but pause
but-
right there, because the Secretary General said you needed $500 million to run the Office of UN Women. You got $200 million.
Yeah, we'll continue working on that. But many people who had given us a very strong political support didn't understood that needed financial support too. But we're
Would you
working
put the
on that.
U.S. in that category?
I know I'm not going to put anybody in that category
I'll
because,
let her put us in that
because I'm an
category.
optimistic,
6 million from the
because
US.
I'm a very optimistic person. I'll try
And you're
continue
polite,
working.
but yes.
But but not only polite. I believe that we need to continue working to convince those who believe that women are dangerous in the world, and to convince them that on the other hand that we can contribute a lot. But I want to tell you, money is important, though. We need other issues too, and we have been working on that. It's not that we made a diagnosis. One of the problems when you have a new situation of the transitional to democracy is that everybody is so happy that they start creating new parties, new NGOs, new organizations. So people get very fragmented. And when you have a problem, and particularly when it's not in the priority of the ones who are making decisions, one of the important lessons of all democratic transitions is unity. Unity in terms after some objectives. So what we did in Egypt, we supported the capacity, and the second is that you can put conditions, but I truly believe that transitions to democracy need to respect their own path, the ownership of the process, particularly in places when they're so proud of what they have done. So you can try to push with incentive, but not to impose some things. We need to convince. But I have to tell you,
Really, even if it means women are excluded?
no, because that's not it. I mean, you don't need to go there. You can make incentives more than punish. You can make incentives. And we're talking, and we're doing that. And Ian Martin in Libya is working with the MTC, and we're trying to insist, and we're working organizing women. But let's go back, because in Egypt, we helped organize the National Women's Charter. And they developed a very important letter and statement, and they're talking to the different candidates to the presidency, so if they are going to support those candidates, if they are going to support that charter. And it's very comprehensive, from women in political positions to women in the economy. You know, in Egypt, 40% of the women are illiterate. So, and of course, and the poverty is high. But that's one issue. In Tunis, the same. Yesterday, the Minister of Tunisia was saying that now there are 116 parties registered to the elections on the 23rd of October. Why this election is so important, and why we have progress, even though it's not we don't know the final word yet. In April, the group who's organizing the elections voted and approved a CPER law. That means that it's 50% men, 50% women. And in the list, I mean, any party who wants to go to election has to register 50% candidate women, 50% candidate men. They opted for this, not for the quota, but then with the name of a man, a name of a woman, a name of a man. So that's why it's called CPER law. We'll see what happens. But what I mean is that there's a lot of progress, but we need to continue working all together to try to create, I would say, a positive environment so women can play a role. We have to ensure that women can be ministries on the new governments. And the problem is that when you start working on this, you know why I hear always, we don't have enough women with capacities and skills.
Oh, that's an old one, yeah.
It's very old, yes.
We would love to have a woman on the board, but you know, there just aren't any.
Yes.
But I think,
But there's so many.
I
The
think
Ford
there's
Foundation would never say that, though, we're proud to say.
There's a related issue to that, and it is the perception that somehow women can only be viewed through the prism of victims. And God knows they have been abused and suffered all kinds of atrocities that people in this room are certainly very cognizant of. But women are leaders, and they are on the front lines, and they fully have the capacity. And part of the problem is within governments that are trying to be helpful to solve conflicts or make positive steps in transitions, they're not sure themselves where they come down on the role that women need to play. And then you've got whatever exists in the country at stake. But take a potential for peace any place. That potential is going to be subverted if women are marginalized or silenced. And I think it's that understanding that needs to come to the fore more significantly to have the kinds of activities and supports and changes that have to happen, or all of these efforts to create positive change, to create peace solutions are not going to hold.
I want to talk about women in economics for just a minute, and then we'll open it up to a few questions. And both of our guests, our experts, are on very tight UN schedules today. But I mean, the numbers are staggering when you look at the stakeholders, the women as stakeholders in the economy. I mean, the latest, I'm sure you know this much better than I, but I have to say I had to go back and read it twice. I was sure I read it wrong. In Africa, according to UNDP, 52% of the population are women. Women do 75% of the agricultural work, produce 60 to 80% of the food, and make 10% of the income, and own 1% of the land. So how do you begin to reverse that? How do you begin? Because we understand there are all kinds of other things that flow from not having any of the economic levers at your disposal. How do you begin to look at that?
I think one of the best ways is understanding, the decision makers understanding what's at stake. The Secretary of State made a major speech last week at APEC that took place in San Francisco, where she laid out the economic case for women in terms of economic growth, as she called it, the participation age. Without participation, we are not going to have the growth we want to see. We're not going to have the kinds of positive changes in economies that need to take place. Now, what is different today in a very significant way is that we are no longer operating in an evidence-free zone. We're no longer saying, well, this is the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do, no question. But it is also the strategic, economic, evidence-based thing to do if you really want to create growth, and women need to be a critical part of that. So today we've got a plethora of studies from all kinds of sources that show women run small and medium-sized businesses are the accelerators of growth, and demonstrate the kinds of outcomes would take place if the barriers that women confront can be overcome, and that's what's critical.
So how do you do that?
Well, I think that one of the things we have to do, even though it's to try to put ourselves on the shoes and on the head of the people who make decisions. And that's why Hillary's speech was fantastic, because she put a very strong, she built a very strong case. I mean, it's all information that's there, but she put it all together in a very compelling way. The problem is that you ask yourself, why is happening this? Everybody knows that it's so important. Two problems. First, not enough women are participating, But second, there's a lot of women participating in economy, and it's not acknowledged, the important impact of that. So we need to have more women participating, but we also need to have more women acknowledge their contribution, but also formalize. Because, for example, in Africa, we work a lot on cross-border traders, and there are lots of women in marketplace and so on. But usually it's very informal. They don't have all they don't have the benefits of being a real worker or entrepreneur.
Right.
So we start with a lot of programs. But any program that any international organization can do, they're very small. So what we need to do is try to convince, and that's what we have been working through the regions, to try to build a very strong economical, political, and social case why it's the same idea that it's not only the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do. On Friday, the World Bank will launch the new report, and I think it will provide us with even more data that shows so clearly why not investing in women is the worst thing, the more less strategic thing and that a country can do. So we're working on that.
So unless it's in the interest of the stakeholders as they
Yes.
exist now, it's never really going to change
yes.
without some other.
Yesterday, there was a panel on food security with a top CEO of a major business that deals in agriculture. And the whole point was that there's a huge disparity between women farmers, who in many places are the majority of the small farmers, and the resources that are available to them that are available to men. But what all the studies today show, that when that is equalized, the women not only are that much more productive, they equal the production levels of the men, but they even can outpace them. Yeah. Now, when you look at the hunger crisis today, you look at the needs to grow productivity today, the kinds of percentage increases that women farmers represent, if these resources are made available, dramatically shifts. Now, this gentleman said, I had no idea this was the case. I knew I was going to be on this panel. I began to look at and ask questions about what my company is doing. And we really have to begin to shift the way we make some of our decisions. And those are among the kinds of things that have to happen today for these kinds of changes to take place among major stakeholders.
But also we are working with the private sector in terms of considering women in all the levels of the supply chain. Women as workers, women as SMEs, women as traders, as producers, as CEOs, in all the range. But if I had to say what else we have to do, because unfortunately there's not a vaccine to this disease of gender inequality. I would love to have it, but there's no.
They're working on it.
So
yes.
we need to, but it has taken too much time. So we need to do a lot of things, and they're all intertwined. Because if you don't have women in the decision-making positions, usually these things are under the table, are not priority. So that's why for us it's so important also to work much more on political participation, women leaderships, and so on. And yesterday we had a wonderful forum also where was Hillary, President Dilma Rousseff from Brazil, President of Kyrgyzstan, Catherine Ashton from the European Union, and so on, because we think that also one image is worth 1,000 words, and we need to show that it's important to have women at different positions in the economic area, but particularly in the political area. We need parliamentarians. It's incredible. In Tanzania or other places, 80% of the agricultural force are women. I mean, globally, worldwide, it's 48%. Yeah, but in some countries of Africa, it's women, the majority. But they don't have inheritance rights. They don't have land rights. But when you have women in parliament, they start caring about this kind of issue. I think we need to build stronger constituencies, women's constituencies, in the way that they can be relevant. Because I had some experiences that I've always thought, what is the difference? In Nepal, women were part of the Maoist army. 40% of the Maoist army were female combatant soldiers. So when they came into the transition, they started putting those issues. There were voices that were heard. I'm not saying that I'm going to distribute guns. Don't misunderstand me. But I mean, I'm
but
talking about...
But if the vaccine doesn't work, that's where we're going.
Guns.
No.
Well, everyone will take their own decisions. But what I mean is that's where we need to build power. Mm-hmm. I mean, women need to be powerful. Otherwise, we're not relevant enough, not to consider. Because you have to put yourself in the place of the people who are making decisions. They have so many different tensions, so many different priorities. So we need to make women a priority. So that's why I believe that we need more women in parliament that can ensure those laws. And we have had great experiences in Nepal, as a matter of fact, in Kyrgyzstan. I just was in a meeting with Rosa, the president of Kyrgyz, and they have, we helped them in having a new law for women, giving women's lands right. They didn't have in Kyrgyz either. So we need to advance much more. There's so many things we can do. And I think that it's a great possibility to work with all this audience and other partners we have everywhere.
I want each of you to think, because you've traveled so extensively around the world, I want each of you to tell me one example of one on-the-ground program that you've seen that you think is something that gives you hope for the future. And while you're thinking about that, I was traveling with my 13-year-old son in Tanzania this summer, and we went to a village where they said, the women raise the children, they do all the farming, they build the fires, they get the wood. And I said, what do the men do? And they said, the men are the deciders. They decide disputes. And my son said, it's good to be a man. And I said, mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so one example, and then we'll go to questions.
Well, Liberia. Two examples, but linked. Women make decisions. I mean, there has this palata. This is places where in the past men decided negotiation about conflict. But now women are in there. We help them build the infrastructure with a local NGO. And they're the ones, for example, in ending violence against women, the ones who make decisions and take and sort of a popular trial, if I may say, but they then bring it to the police or to whatever it is. So, and I saw it working, and it really works. And the second thing is in Liberia, it's markets. We, with President Ellen Johnson, yes, we supported a lot of marketplace where women learn to read, to write, but also they improve their conditions. They had places to have the children there. So, I mean, and they are really changing the women's life. And I think you can, I mentioned this, but I could tell you so many different experiences that, first of all, we need to scale up. And that's why I'm calling for my colleagues from FAO, IFAD, UNDP, us, and some others, and WFP, World Food Program, to work, because next year CSW is about women, rural women, livelihood, and we want to work very strong on improving the women's condition on those places where poverty is big, and there's lots of women and children living in very difficult, but very resilient on the other hand.
Well, there are obviously lots of programs, and I do think the challenge for us is to make sure that those that are really solving problems get scaled up, because instead of reinventing the wheel, there's a lot that could be achieved in bigger numbers. But Michelle rightly talked about women's political empowerment, and I think it is the toughest nut to crack. It is the hardest road that women travel, but until they're in positions of power and decision-making, I don't think we're going to see the kinds of changes we need to see. Even where they haven't reached critical mass, if you call critical mass today 30%, just having them in these forums with enough numbers to put issues on the table and bring about change. I think the example of the women in the panchayats in India, for example, the decision to have a quota for these very local level elective positions has created what is being called the silent democratic revolution in India. I have been in situations where, and most recently in Rajasthan, where I met with a group as large as half of this audience of women who are in the throes of doing local government. Among the most amazing people I have met any place, and this is replicated throughout the country. They are making decisions differently. They are dealing with safe drinking water, sanitation, education, health. They are the agents of change in their communities. But for that change to be able to take place, they have to be empowered. Empowered by getting into government through a quota, which does not go on interminably. They are now running in record numbers for non-quota seats. And they need to have their capacity built so they can be that much more effective. And this story needs to affect other regional actors. We're going to do some work to make that happen with Pakistanis and Bangladeshis. I think this is among the kind of phenomena that we've got to grow if we're going to see the kinds of change we need to see.
2 quick questions. Yes? Hi. Oh, we can hear you. Belt it out.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Bunch from the Center for Women's Global Leadership, and I'm really happy to have this panel. I would just like to ask two parts of one question. One of the goals of women's rights as human rights was to get more government accountability to implement those promises, just as you mentioned, Madame Bachelet. So I would like some reflection on, in these 15 years, have we been able to get more accountability using human rights, or examples of that, and what that has meant, and more access to justice, as the new UN Women report on access to justice talks about, how using human rights is not only rhetorical, but has given us more tools. And secondly, kind of going along with that, I also think we've experienced an enormous cultural and religious backlash against women's rights activists, in particular, feminist activists. And I would like, if you have a chance to speak to how we support not only the movement in the new places, but the movement of forces to isolate the women's rights activists. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah. Okay, sure. Question, the other question, and then we'll have the. Yes, sure.
Thank you. My name is Hussein. I'm a human rights defender from Egypt, and we were happy to receive both distinguished speakers in Egypt recently. But I think some of the comments you made about Egypt, I agree fully with them about the challenges that are facing us in integrating women in the process. But I think also there are some lessons to be learned for other countries, in that part of the challenge now is not necessarily is not only the disease, the virus of gender inequality, and is not necessarily cultural or religious, but it's simply our need to work more on communicating women's rights and gender equality as part of the agenda that this revolution started to achieve. The perception sometimes is that we're trying to squeeze in women's issues and gender equality now that we've unseated Mubarak. But frankly, that's our failure to effectively and strategically communicate that this is the social justice and equality revolution, and as such, we don't need to add women on top. Women are already embedded. And in order to do this, we have to change the way that we as a community have been dealing with women's issues and have been defining impact when it comes to gender. And just to conclude, I mean, Madame Bachelet, the question is, how are you going to deal with first ladies in the future? Because I respectfully encourage you to go back to your office and ask for a list of all the UN awards that Suzanne Mubarak received. And I think that's part of the challenge. Part of the challenge is that we have to identify impact, and Ambassador Verveer, now that we have access to WikiLeaks, some alleged cables, of course, show that your government spoke very favorably of Suzanne Mubarak in private correspondence. So how do we balance the need for achieving impact with the need also to protect the integrity of the women's rights cause, and not to taint it by jumping in bed with dictators or their wives?
Well, we have two questions which could take another half an hour, but go.
Well, I would say that there has been progress, Charlotte, anyway, and we see it even, and it's very important how we are trying to work together with CEDAW, with the people and with the shadow report and so on. So there has been progress. But of course, I think you always need to advance much more on accountability. But it's sort of a not so easy issue. The thing that it depends on my hands, if I may say, not completely, but in part, is I have to hold the whole UN system accountable too, because how the whole UN system is doing much more for women is very important. I mean, nobody, and you know perfectly well that the General Assembly resolution did not expect from UN Women, and that's why part of the reason we don't have much money is because we're supposed to not only work with our money, but the whole system should provide more resources in
How's
terms
that going?
of development. Well, it's going, and it will continue going, because you know what? If you don't do it, they won't be able to fulfill their own mandates.
Right.
I mean, there won't be development if you have women outside of the possibility of development. So I would say there has been progress, but still we need to do much more. And in that sense, the UN can play one part of the role, but it's so important where the international community as a whole, but also our civil society partners and women's organizations, but also insist our women's in parliament, in the different leadership position, because it's not easy, and we need to do much more. And we'll have to find and think on incentives and how we incentivize countries to really make all the rest. I don't want to insist, because I mentioned at the beginning of my words this little issue about discussing about sexual education as almost a dirty word. So I think there is this danger of setback in many of these areas. I mean, but even though in international meetings where I've been, nobody speaks anymore about sexual and reproductive rights. I mean, the word family planning is very timidly said, you know? So there is sort of something there. And I believe that, of course, when you go to any country, you have to think on the language that can be heard, because otherwise people close their eyes and don't hear anything. So you can adapt the language. I agree on that. But the thing is that you have to be, all of us making advocacy why the right of sexual and reproductive health is essential to women. And I think we need to do much more. This has sort of disappeared in the discussions on that sense. And to your question, well, I have to tell you that as a matter of fact, and my intention is to meet head of states and head of governments. That's my focus. I mean, in some countries, first ladies have a very important role, and of course, I will respect and have meetings with them. But my essential, how would I say, objectives are the people who are in the decision making: head of parliament, head of states, head of government, private sector, women's organization, and so on. So I won't give you the answer from the past. I wasn't here. I'm not responsible, whatever happened. But having said that, Lady Mubarak did do some very important initiatives that today, unfortunately, disappeared. The quota law was during that time, and the military council rejected it. And they said because that was not equality between men and women, and because nobody wants women activists to go into parliament. So I think there are some issues that sometimes the divorce law was also another advance. So I think you don't need to kill the message when you want to kill the messenger. And sometimes people confuse these things, you know? You can have a political idea on somebody, but the good ideas have to remain. I mean, you can change the political system, but if something's good for women, it should continue, even though it has started in another government. That could be not the good one, you know? So I think from our part, we always, I mean, the UN has to work with all the national government partners. And you have the opportunity there. And for example, in some countries, we need to ensure that those governments don't permit impunity on gender-based violence, for example. And so we need to work with everybody, with the government, because we need to convince them. If I work with the governments that already believe in human rights and women's rights, I won't be doing my job. I need to work particularly with those that are more complicated, because otherwise it's like low-hanging fruit, but I'm not being very effective. But I think the important thing is to maintain always, I mean, UN has to be neutral in terms of not being on one side or on the other, but never neutral in terms of not respecting the principles of the values and human rights. And that is what we need to do.
That sounds like a pretty good...
Let me go to Egypt first. And I couldn't agree with you more about the integral nature of women's rights and what Tahrir Square was all about in terms of ending oppression, freedom, economic empowerment, et cetera. And I hope you succeed, because I do think these issues have not to be sidelined, but to be integrated in terms of what you all have achieved. I agree completely with Michelle on what she said about the so-called Mubarak taint. And I am frankly very worried about what I see happening, and I've said this to some of the younger NGO members: divorce laws, laws to eradicate child marriage, deal with FGM, the quota in the parliament. Good was done, not just by the association with the First Lady, but by pioneering human rights activists in Egypt to achieve those goals. Today, what I hear and I fear is that the baby is going to be thrown out with the bathwater. Because of the Mubarak taint, these issues somehow don't matter anymore, and they do matter. And I've sat with so many women in Egypt for whom that divorce law means a lot. I've been in forswearing ceremonies when whole communities came together in Egypt to say, no more child marriage. I truly worry about what can happen, and I think that is something you all need to be vigilant about. Well, you know, guilt by association is, I think you have to be smart enough to take those issues that people struggled so hard to get. Mrs. Mubarak used her position to make some of it happen. But that doesn't mean these now don't matter because she was somehow associated with them. And just quickly, Charlotte, and thank you for all you've done over the years, the pioneer among us. I think what's happening in the Arab world, while certainly in many ways progress can be set back by Islamist forces, there is a lot of good that is happening, and it's to listen to the women at the grassroots level. I mean, think of what happened in Morocco a few years ago in terms of the family law reform, which is perhaps the hardest thing to do in some of these societies, to reform family law. Significant human rights implications. They were able to do it because they reclaimed Quranic values. They made it acceptable when the opponents were saying this is against everything we believe in. And the women said, no, it's consistent. And then when the king proclaimed the new law, the Quranic verse went right beneath right to custody of children, or whatever the provisions of it were. And I think as progress is being made, one of the most important things, and I hope Ford will be there for this, is to bring women together from across these societies who are struggling with these issues, for women to gain their rightful position. Tremendous leadership in these societies. And they can learn from each other. They want to learn from each other. They want to have it contextualized in the commonality that they have in their own cultures. And we have got to enable them to be able to make progress in the ways that they are best able to understand that they can achieve their goals.
Thank you so much, both of you. Such an illuminating panel. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Great. Thank you. Great job. You're only slightly late.